There was a time when one thing about Tiger Woods felt certain: control. Not confidence, not talent, control. The kind that made pressure irrelevant. The kind that made outcomes feel delayed, but never in doubt. But in 2026, his name returned to the headlines for something that had nothing to do with winning. Another crash. A vehicle overturned on a quiet road in Florida. No collision, no fatalities, nothing that should have mattered. And yet, it did. Because with Tiger Woods, nothing exists in isolation. This was not just an accident. It was a moment that reopened a question that had been building for years. Not about his game, but about his condition. Because the change did not come suddenly. There was no single collapse. No clear ending. Only injuries that stayed longer than expected. Recoveries that restored movement, but not certainty. A body that kept going, but no longer responded the same way. And slowly, almost quietly, something began to disappear. Control. So when the headlines returned in 2026, they did not feel new. They felt familiar. Not like a beginning, but like something unfinished coming back into focus. Because this is no longer a story about a champion chasing one more victory. It is about a man standing at the edge of what his own body will allow, facing something no opponent has ever forced him to face before: limit. And this time, the question is no longer whether he can win again. It is something far more difficult to answer. What happens when a man who once controlled everything can no longer control himself? On March 27, 2026, that question stopped being abstract. It became real. Tiger Woods was involved in a car accident on a road in Florida. His vehicle overturned while attempting to pass a truck. There was no direct collision. No one else was injured. On paper, it was contained, almost ordinary. But what made this moment different was not the crash itself. It was what it represented. Because an overturned vehicle is not just an image. It is a loss of control, made visible. And for someone whose entire identity had been built on precision, discipline, and control, even a moment like that feels different. Not shocking, familiar. Because this was not the first time his name had appeared in a situation like this. And that is what changed everything. There was no collective disbelief, no sense that something impossible had just happened. Only a quiet recognition, as if the event itself mattered less than what it might mean. So the focus shifted, away from the road, away from how the vehicle overturned, and towards something far less visible: the man behind the wheel. Because with Tiger Woods, moments like this do not stand alone. They connect, they echo, they carry history within them. And this moment, contained as it appeared, felt like part of something larger. Not a beginning, a continuation, not of an incident, but of a pattern. And once that pattern becomes visible, the story changes. It is no longer about what happened on the road. It becomes about something far more difficult to define. What might have been happening within him, long before the moment ever occurred. What followed did not escalate dramatically. It narrowed. The moment moved from an accident into an investigation. Procedures were initiated, questions were asked, tests were administered. And at first, the situation seemed to move toward a clear answer. There was no alcohol. The breathalyzer returned 0. For a brief moment, it felt like the simplest explanation had already been removed, as if the story might resolve itself quickly. But it didn't. Because removing one answer did not end the question. It changed it. Additional tests were requested. Further evaluation was required. Not just to determine what he had taken, but whether he had been affected. And this is where the clarity began to fade. A refusal to provide a urine sample, an allegation of driving while impaired. Not confirmed, but not dismissed. And just like that, the center of the story shifted again. Away from the road, away from the crash, towards something far less visible. Condition. Because an accident can be explained. A moment of lost control can be understood. But an investigation introduces something else entirely. Uncertainty. Not about what happened, but about what might have been happening beneath it. And for Tiger Woods, that distinction changes everything. There was a time when any question could be answered on the course, through performance, through dominance. But this moment offered no such escape. There was no tournament to redirect attention, no victory to reshape the narrative, only questions. And within those questions, something began to change. Not dramatically, not conclusively, but undeniably. The story was no longer asking what happened. It was asking why. And that is a far more difficult question to answer. If alcohol had already been ruled out, then the question did not disappear. It deepened. Because removing the simplest explanation does not resolve uncertainty. It exposes something more complex. If not alcohol, then what? The answer did not begin on the night of the incident. It began years earlier, through injuries that never fully left, through surgeries that repaired, but never restored, through a body that had been pushed again and again, beyond what it was built to endure. For Tiger Woods, pain was never a single moment. It became a condition, something managed, something carried, something that did not always appear, but was always present. And within that kind of reality, another layer inevitably forms. Medication. Not as escape, not as scandal, but as necessity. Painkillers. Prescribed treatments. Substances intended not to enhance performance, but to make movement possible, to make continuation sustainable. And this is where the story shifts again, away from suspicion and toward context. Because the question is no longer simply whether something was taken. It becomes why something might have been needed. A body that has endured repeated trauma does not return to its original state. It adapts. It compensates. It requires support, just to function at a level others would consider normal. And within that space, the line begins to blur. Between recovery and reliance, between treatment and effect. So when the idea of impairment enters the conversation, it does not immediately point to wrongdoing. It points to possibility. The possibility that what remained in his system was not alcohol, but something else. Something quieter. Something prescribed. Something connected not to choice, but to consequence. Because this is not a story about recklessness. It is a story about accumulation. Years of strain, years of repair, years of continuing forward, even as the body began to resist. And eventually, all of that leaves a mark. Not always visible, not always acknowledged, but present. So the real question is no longer what happened on the road. It is whether the very things that allowed him to continue had begun to affect him in ways he could no longer fully control. What makes this moment difficult to dismiss is that it does not stand alone. it echoes. Because for Tiger Woods, what happened in 2026 does not feel like a beginning. It feels like a return, not to the same event, but to the same structure. This is not the first time control has been questioned. In 2017, there was already a moment that carried a similar weight. An arrest under suspicion of driving under the influence. No alcohol was found. Instead, it was a combination of prescribed medications taken within the context of recovery. Even then, the story was not about recklessness. It was about a body trying to function under the weight of its own history, a system attempting to stabilize itself through means that were necessary, but not without consequence. And surrounding that moment was something even larger. Years of surgeries, particularly to the spine, each one attempting to repair what had been damaged, each one allowing continuation, but never fully restoring what had been lost. The foundation of his control had already begun to change. And then, in 2021, another turning point. Not on the course, but on the road. A serious car accident that left him with significant injuries. A moment that forced yet another phase of reconstruction, physical and psychological. That incident made something visible that had been building for years, the fragility of a body that once seemed untouchable. So when 2026 enters the timeline, it does not introduce a new idea, it reinforces an existing one. The crash, the investigation, the questions about impairment. None of these exist in isolation. They align across different years, in different forms, but with the same underlying tension: endurance versus limitation. This is why the moment feels heavier than it appears, because it carries memory within it, a sense that what is happening now has happened before, not in exact detail, but in pattern. And once that pattern becomes visible, the story changes again. It is no longer about one incident, not one mistake, not one phase. It becomes something continuous, a progression, one that links injury, recovery, dependence, and public scrutiny into a single arc. And within that arc, the realization is unavoidable. This is not a sudden fall. It is a long confrontation with the limits of the body, one that has been unfolding quietly for years and is only now coming fully into focus. At a certain point, the story stops being about competition. It becomes something else, quieter, but far more decisive. Because for Tiger Woods, the most difficult opponent was never standing across from him on the course. It was within him, shaping every movement, every decision, every attempt to return. The body that once carried him through pressure without hesitation had begun to change. Not suddenly, but irreversibly. The rupture of the Achilles tendon was not just another injury. It was a signal, a reminder that even the most basic elements of movement could no longer be taken for granted. And the spine, after years of strain and multiple surgeries, was no longer a source of stability. It had become something else, a point of negotiation, something that required constant management, adjustment, and restraint. And this is where the reality becomes difficult to avoid, because decline does not arrive as a single moment. It unfolds gradually, almost invisibly, until the accumulation becomes undeniable. The body does not fail all at once. It changes, losing small margins of certainty, small degrees of control, until what once felt automatic becomes conditional. Movements become deliberate, endurance becomes calculation, recovery becomes uncertain, and in that process, The distance begins to form, not as a fall, but as a gap between what he was and what is still possible now. This is why the story can no longer be measured by results, because what he is facing is not another player, not another generation rising behind him, but something far more constant. Time, not as an idea, but as a force, working through the body, reshaping it, redefining its limits. And unlike every opponent he has ever faced, this one does not hesitate. It does not make mistakes. It does not give anything back. So the question is no longer how to win. It is whether the terms of the game can still be met at all. Because the game did not take him down. It did not defeat him in a single defining moment. What changed is something more complex. The conditions, the body that once made dominance possible, no longer exists in the same way. And yet the attempt to continue remains, to adapt, to adjust, to find a way forward within new limits. But the nature of the battle has already changed. There is no visible opponent now, no final round that can resolve it. Only time, working through the body, setting boundaries that cannot be negotiated. And this is the battle that matters now. Not because it can be won, but because it cannot be approached in the same way as any battle before. After years defined not by competition, but by recovery, the return did not arrive as a declaration. It emerged quietly, almost cautiously. When Tiger Woods stepped back into the game, the surface looked familiar. The course, the structure, the expectation. But underneath, everything had changed. This was not a return to what once was. It was an attempt to discover what still remained. Because the years away had not been empty. They had been filled with rehabilitation, with repetition, with adjustment, with the slow process of rebuilding a body that no longer responded the same way. Every movement now required intention. Every round required calculation. And when he returned to competition, those realities did not disappear. They defined it. The results themselves were no longer the center of the story, not the leaderboard, not the final position, but the pattern within the performance. Moments of precision, followed by limitation. Flashes of control, interrupted by inconsistency, a rhythm that appeared and then faded. Not a collapse, but not continuity either. And that is where the meaning of this return becomes clear. This was not a comeback in the traditional sense, not a return built on momentum, not a return driven by dominance, but something far more restrained. To participate rather than to control, to compete rather than to define, to continue rather than to reclaim. Because the version of Tiger Woods that once shaped entire tournaments no longer exists in the same form. What remains is different. A presence shaped by memory, by experience, by fragments of what once was. Operating within limits that cannot be ignored. And within those limits, which every round becomes something more than performance. It becomes a test, not of skill alone, but of endurance. Not of strategy alone, but of physical tolerance. Not of greatness, but of sustainability. This is why the return feels different. Because it is no longer driven by the expectation of victory. It is shaped by a quieter question, whether continuation itself is still possible. And in that sense, this is not the comeback of a champion as the world once understood it. It is the return of a man trying to remain. What follows a return like this is not collapse. It is adjustment. a quiet shift in expectation. And for Tiger Woods, that shift carries more weight than any single result, because the conversation around him begins to change, not dramatically, but decisively. The Masters in 2026 is no longer framed as an opportunity. It becomes a question, not whether he can contend, but whether he can even arrive in a form that resembles competition. And that is where the pressure begins to build, not from performance, but from uncertainty. The questions are no longer about winning. They are simpler, more direct. Can he complete 4 rounds? Can his body endure consecutive days? Can he recover fast enough to continue? These are not questions that measure greatness. They define its limits. And within that shift, something else changes. The standard itself. There was a time when anything short of victory felt incomplete, when his presence alone implied contention, when every appearance carried the expectation that he would shape the outcome. That framework no longer holds. Now, simply finishing becomes meaningful. Simply appearing becomes uncertain. The scale has changed, not by choice, but by necessity. And this is why moments like 2026 do not exist on their own. They accumulate, each incident, each recovery, each return, gradually redefining what participation even means. Every appearance now exists within a fragile balance between intention and capability, between desire and limitation. Which is why the central question of his career has begun to dissolve. It is no longer, can he win again? That question belongs to another version of him, another time, another body. The question now is quieter, but far more difficult to confront. Can he still play? Not in isolated moments, but across time, not as memory, but as reality. Because at this stage, the outcome is no longer measured in titles or records. It is measured in continuation, in the ability to begin and actually finish. And that is a standard that cannot be controlled, only tested, one appearance at a time. Which is why this moment does not signal an ending, but it does redefine everything that comes next. A path no longer driven by expectation, but by limitation, and shaped by a single question that now stands at the center of everything. Not whether he can win, but whether he can continue at all. At a certain point, the story begins to move away from what the world expects to see. It settles into something quieter, something that no longer belongs to headlines or performance. Because the version of Tiger Woods that once defined an era no longer exists in the same way. What remains is not the figure constructed by dominance, but the person who continues after it. Not the image built through victory, but the life that unfolds when victory is no longer the center. He is no longer operating from a place of absolute control, the kind that once made outcomes feel inevitable. That version was tied to a body that responded without hesitation, to a time when recovery was immediate, when endurance was assumed. What exists now is different. A man who lives within limits, who understands what his body can do and what it can no longer sustain, and who carries that awareness into every decision. There is no spectacle in this part of the story, no dramatic turn, no single revelation that changes everything at once, only a gradual shift from being seen as something untouchable to becoming something entirely human. And in many ways, that shift reveals more than dominance ever could. Because beyond the game, there is another life, one that was always there, but not always visible. He is a father, present in moments that do not appear on leaderboards, where time is no longer measured in rounds, but in stillness. He is someone who moves through daily life with a body that requires attention, adjustment, restraint, where even simple actions carry a different weight than they once did. And within that reality, identity begins to change, not erased, not diminished, but expanded. Beyond performance, beyond expectation, beyond the version of himself that the world once believed would last forever. Because this is not a fall, it is a return to something more grounded, more personal, more real. And when the noise fades, when the expectations soften, what remains is not the legend on display, but the person who carries that history forward, quietly, without needing to prove anything more. When winning is no longer the center of the story, what remains is not measured in results. It is measured in impact. And for Tiger Woods, that impact was never confined to the scoreboard. He was never just a golfer who accumulated titles, never simply a player who dominated an era and then passed it on. What he changed was deeper than that. Structural. The way golf was watched, the way it was followed, the way it was understood by audiences far beyond its traditional boundaries. All of that shifted during his presence, and none of it fully returned to what it had been before. He was not perfect. There were interruptions, moments that broke the illusion of control. But perfection is not what defines a legacy. Transformation is, and that is where his place becomes clear. Not as the most flawless player to ever exist, but as the one who redefined what modern golf could be. He expanded its reach, changed its energy, brought a level of intensity and visibility that moved the game beyond its old limits. And beyond the sport itself, his presence extended further, into culture, into identity, into the idea of what an athlete could represent. He became a symbol, not just of success, but of possibility. Someone who existed at the intersection of sport, culture, and influence in a way that could not be confined to one category. And this is why the present does not define him. The uncertainty, the limitations, the questions about whether he can continue. None of these change what has already been established, because legacy does not operate in the present tense. It is formed through what has already been done, through what has already reshaped the environment others now exist within. The players who came after him did not enter the same game he once did. They entered a version that had already been transformed. The audience that watches today does not see golf the way it was once seen. That shift is permanent. So what remains is not a comparison between who he was and who he is now. It is a recognition of what cannot be undone. He does not need to win again to remain significant. He does not need to return to dominance to justify what he was, because what defines him has already been set. Not in what he continues to do, but in what he made possible. And that is something that no result can erase, because it no longer belongs to him alone. It exists within the game itself, carried forward by everything that followed after him. There was a time when Tiger Woods felt untouchable, not because he never faced difficulty, but because difficulty never seemed to change the outcome. He existed in a space where pressure refined him, where expectation did not limit him, where defeat felt temporary, never final. And over time, that became more than performance. It became an image, a belief the world held on to. That control, at its highest level, could last. But no image survives unchanged when it is carried by a human body. What we see now is not the collapse of that image. It is its transformation. Not the disappearance of greatness, but its return to something more real, more human. Because this was never just a story about winning. It was a story about how long someone could sustain something that defies what is natural. And the answer was never forever. There comes a point where the terms of the battle change, where the opponent is no longer across from you, but within you, where the question is no longer how to defeat others, but how to continue it all. And in that space, the meaning of competition dissolves, replaced by something quieter, but far more absolute. Limit. This is the final battle. Not because it is the most visible, but because it cannot be approached the way any battle before it was. There is no strategy that restores what time has taken, no performance that resets the body, no victory that removes the cost of everything that came before. And yet, the battle continues, not for dominance, but for continuation, not to prove superiority, but to remain. And this is where the answer becomes clear. A legend does not end when they lose, not when they fall short of expectation, not when others surpass them. A legend ends when they can no longer fight in the way that once defined them. Not because the will is gone, but because the conditions that made that fight possible no longer exist. And in that realization, there is no dramatic ending, no single moment that defines the conclusion, only a quiet understanding that what once felt endless was always temporary, and that even the greatest careers do not end in a moment. They transition from dominance to acceptance, from control to understanding, from the myth back to the man. A golfer who once redefined what dominance looked like, a symbol that moved beyond the boundaries of sport, and now, a man facing something far more personal than competition. Tiger Woods is no longer standing at the center of the game in the way he once did. He is standing at the edge of something quieter, where the noise of expectation fades, and what remains is not performance, but reflection. Not a final victory, not a final defeat, but a moment of understanding. Because in the end, what defines him is not how long he stayed at the top, but how he continues when the top is no longer the point. And in that space, the story does not end with applause or with silence. It continues in a different form. If you are drawn to the quiet truth behind legendary names, subscribe to Icons and Legacies, where we explore not just fame, but what remains after it fades.
Thank you.